everybody, this is News Now Wyoming. Today we're going to talk about an officer who unlawfully arrested a Good Samaritan for obstruction of justice. We're going to first watch a little bit of the video. You can go ahead if you want to watch the full video. It is certainly worth watching. Do a search for the Life and Liberty Law Office. I'll also try to include a link to this as well. This case is very concerning. It happens here just south of me in Colorado. And so much of it you see being bad. But let's go. So, a little history here. The man that you're about to see get arrested, he came up on an accident. A motorcyclist was on his side. It was underneath his motorcycle. Some of the people helped get him off and called the ambulance and cops. So he helped. He did what he could. Okay.
Where is the bike at? The bike's parked on the blue side, yeah, the blue one there. We pulled it off. Okay, you want to come and talk to me? I don't know what happened. Well, you pulled the bike off him. I'm not talking to nobody. Really? These guys saw what happened. I didn't. Okay, if you're not talking to anybody, you can leave. Well, you can leave.
Oh, so you can leave. Okay, dismissal. Dismissal by the cop. Okay?
You're dismissed. No. We can't leave. I'm not leaving. Okay, then come and talk to me. No, I'm not going to come talk to you. I'm not going to come talk to you. Police officer, man. I know. Did you pull the bike? Did you pull the bike off him? Did you pull the bike off him? I did not.
Oh, that's very important. Did you pull the bike off of him? I did not. Okay? Direct answer to a direct question. When we get to later on in the video, you'll see why that's very important.
Okay. You just told me you did.
Okay.
Preston, what? You got an ID on your bus? I didn't need an ID now. Okay. Well, that sense. I got a uncooperative witness. Come on over here. I need to talk to you. Constitutional right. I need to talk. I don't want to talk to you. You have to talk. I don't want to talk. No, I don't. You do. No, I don't. Okay, you've inserted yourself. I came down here to help them. So I don't have to talk to anybody. I don't have to talk to anybody. I don't have to talk.
So, I want to know, what are the cops wanting from civilians? Do they want us to cooperate? Or do they just want to make enemies out of us? What do they want? What is it? What is their goal? Do they just want us to help and then leave and screw the police altogether? I mean, what do you want from us as civilians? Because I want to help the guy that's needing it. Screw the police. Screw what the government says. I want to help somebody that needs help. But not if it's going to provide you all this crap.
Anybody. Okay, either you're going to sit here and talk to me, we'll just have a short conversation, or we're going to arrest you for obstruction. No, you're not. I'm not obstructing you.
Oh, arresting for obstruction. All right, well, let's take a look here. Obstructing a peace officer in Colorado. A person commits obstruction when he or she, by threatening to use violence, force, or physical interference, knowingly obstructs, impairs, or hinders the enforcement of penal law, preservation of peace, abatement of fire by a firefighter, or application of medical treatment or emergency assistance. So he is obstructing by... Did he threaten them? How is he obstructing? That's how exactly is he obstructing here? Okay, so illegal arrest.
You're right here. Okay. I'm not obstructing nothing. Okay. These guys are taking care of it. Please just come talk to me. No. Okay, turn around. I don't want to talk to you. Turn around right now. No. No. Turn around. Videotape this, Sherry. I'm already doing it. It's right here. No. Turn around. No, you're wrong. Turn around. My constitutional rights. I don't have to talk to you. I don't have to ID myself. Turn around. Turn around. I came down here to help. I don't know what happened.
I want to watch the fight.
I'm telling you that. Put your hand behind your back. Why does he want to talk to me? I'm not telling you again. No, Preston, put Put your hand behind your back.
You're being a little bit of a dick. Nice friend here. I don't give a shit if I'm being a dick. The law is the law. I do not have to obey the cops' illegal orders. I do not have to talk to police. If I am summoned to court, I have to answer a summons. I have to answer a court order. I do not have to talk to the police at any time in my life if I do not wish to.
No, you're being wrong. But you don't, you're being wrong. Videotape this, Sherry. He's gonna get you if you videotape this shit. What are you fucking with me for? What are you fucking with me for?
Okay, so 2 cops.
What are you fucking with me for?
2 cops it took. Okay. Let's just fast forward a little bit here. They do get him down. They get him in cuffs.
This is fucked up. Tuck that knee in. This is fucked up. This is fucked up.
He is hurt. We'll talk about the injuries during the actual lawsuit here. But it did take a couple cops. So now they get to also add resisting arrest to the charge, right? I mean, that's the way it works. No, the courts have ruled that if you are resisting an unlawful arrest, you are fully able to, and they can't charge you with the crap. Maybe assaulting a police officer if you did that, but there's no evidence of that happening here. Whew. Alright. So let's just skip forward here. Where... Why is it all
Black
okay.
Eagles thing. Okay. He was the one. It's 2 officers who have checked them, and I loosened them. And I want to talk to your fucking supervisor right now. Not when I get to the cop shop.
Try and find a specific spot here where he lies.
Okay. You're here? Yeah. I need statements from the guy in the blue black shirt. Okay. The guy in the black Eagles thing. Okay. He was the one who moved the bike over there, or what? Fucking lawsuit. Okay. Like I said, this is my partner Shane. He's gonna check it. Yeah, thank you. I don't have any like.
Okay, first, this whole silent, I hate when they shut off their cams to talk. Should be against policy. They should immediately lose their jobs. Because here is he telling them, change your story, man. Your story isn't good enough. Let's make it stronger. I don't know. I don't trust them. But I don't know what they're talking about. But and again, this whole silent crap. Let's talk with our hands.
I'm gonna mute since I'm really not talking to anybody at this point.
Where does he lie?
Just want to let you know, okay? Alright. Thank you. Yeah, what's going on with the actual accident? So, I'm not meeting to talk to the officer now.
Yeah, mute, because what happens with the actual accident has no bearing on anything, does it? Okay. corrupt ass police, man. I really don't. Okay, so at some point in this video, and find it, tag it, let me know in the comments exactly where it is. But somewhere in there, he tells his supervisor when he pulls up that the man told him he was the one to move the bike. And so now it's also destroying evidence. Okay, so even if you were the one to move the bike, they moved the bike to save the man's life. How the hell is that destroying evidence? But that's why he said he had to get the statement from him, even though one of the first questions he asked, and we saw it, is this were you the one to move the bike? And he said no. Alright, now let's get to the lawsuit, because that is the fun part, right? Alright, so Preston Sowl versus Loveland, the stupid officer. Now I do want to point one more thing out really quick here. I say there is no such thing as a good cop. None. Why? Because there were two officers right there, right next to him, when Mr. Ash, I'm not going to call him Officer Ash because that implies that there's goodness. I should respect this officer who, we'll talk about him here after the lawsuit. But there were two others that watched him make this unlawful arrest, and nobody stopped him. And then there were total of, 8 or 9 cops there on site, and nobody stopped him. There was a sergeant on site. He didn't stop him from making an unlawful arrest. How is this Sergeant Bartnays a good cop? He's not. He's a piece of shit because he allowed something illegal to happen by one of his officers. There is no such thing as good cop. Alright. Plaintiff Preston Sowl, by and through his attorney, Sarah Schickel, blah, blah, blah. On September 22nd, 2019, defendant Officer Paul Ash of the Loveland Police Department beat up, arrested, and falsely charged plaintiff Preston Sowl for the non-existent crime of not talking to him. Defendant officers personally participated in these violations of Mr. Sowl's constitutional rights under the 4th, 14th, and 1st Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Defendant supervisor person failed to intervene, failed to report the unlawful use of excessive force, and then assistant defendants Ash and DeLima in attempting to cover up their misconduct. He also authorized the continuing handcuffing of Mr. Sowl despite multiple requests from medical personnel to remove the handcuffs from the injured Mr. Sowl. All defendants' officers' conduct revealed unconstitutional customs, practices, and policies at Loveland Police Department, as well as failures to train and supervise, which were driving forces behind the officers' misconduct. Give me 1 second here. The defendant's actions caused Mr. Sowl to endure shoulder blade fracture, complete shoulder dislocation, later requiring complete shoulder replacement surgery, multiple contusions to his head and body, false arrest, pain, permanent injuries, suffering, humiliation, emotional distress, damage to his reputation, attorney's fees, and other damages. Jurisdiction questions are always stupid. It happened in Colorado, so this is District Court of Colorado. Okay, so boring stuff. You guys can download it. I think this is 33 pages, so it's $3 to buy it from Pacer. Plaintiff Preston Sowl is a citizen of the United States and was at all times relevant hereto a resident of and domiciled in the state of Colorado. He resides in Loveland, Colorado. Defendant Paul Ash is a natural person who was at all times relevant to this complaint, duly appointed and sworn as a police officer for the city of Loveland in Loveland, Colorado. At all times relevant hereto, defendant Ash was acting under color of law, including when his actions were in violation of the Constitution and laws of the state of Colorado and the Constitution, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so same thing, and same thing for the sergeant. Defendant city of Loveland is a municipality for purposes of 1983 liability. Late in the afternoon of Sunday, September 22nd, 2019, Preston Sowl and his wife were leaving Charlie L's pub in downtown Loveland, Colorado. I love Charlie's. Alright, fun place. They briefly chatted with some friends and then walked to their parked car in the parking lot. Miss Nix began driving them out of the parking lot when they noticed that blocking their exit from the lot, there was a motorcyclist lying under a downed motorcycle. Miss Nix parked, and both she and Mr. Sowl, along with other bystanders, went over to help the downed rider to help him. Some of the other bystanders reached the motorcyclist first, and they lifted the bike off of him in an effort to render aid. There was no damage to the bike, but the motorcyclist was bleeding and his ankle was observably injured from the fall. Someone called 911. Mr. Sowl and his wife stood by watching. Some of the Samaritans began discussing driving the motorcyclist to the hospital. Mr. Sowl and others said this was not a good idea given the extent of the motorcyclist's injuries, and they should wait for an ambulance to come. The others agreed, and shortly thereafter an ambulance arrived, along with 2 EMTs. A fire truck and Loveland police car also arrived in quick succession. All 3 groups of first responders parked their vehicles in a manner that completely blocked the exit of the parking lot. That is also important, isn't it? You can't leave because everybody's blocking the exit. Okay? The EMTs brought out a stretcher and seated the motorcycle on it and began providing him medical care. Mr. Sowl and his wife, without much alternative, as their only exit to leave the one-way lot was blocked, stood by several feet away continuing to watch. Defendant Officer Paul Ash of the Loveland Police Department arrived and inserted himself into the scene. His actions were captured on various video recordings to include his own body cam, which is here to attached. Officer Ash marched up to the group that were looking on from several feet off as the motorcyclist was receiving medical care. Mr. Sowl was standing furthest away, and Officer Ash approached him directly first. He said, "Where's the bike at?" And he pointed where the bike was parked and said, "Park's down by the side." Officer Ash, who had already seen the bike, and in fact had just walked past it, said, "The blue one?" And Mr. Sowl said, "Yeah, the blue one. We pulled it off." Mr. Ash said, "Okay, do you mind coming and talk to me?" And he said, "I don't know what happened." "Well, you pulled the bike off." He said, "I'm not talking to nobody." Mr. Ash instantly got angry with Mr. Sowl. "Really?" he responded by raising his voice. Wow, they took a word from the video. Raising his voice, Mr. Sowl, remaining calm, pointed to the other witnesses, replied, "These guys saw what happened, I didn't." Took a few steps back to further indicate that he was exercising his right to terminate the encounter. Officer Ash, undeterred, decided he would not permit Mr. Sowl to terminate the encounter. He decided that instead he would escalate things and antagonize Mr. Sowl. "Okay, well, if you're not talking to anybody, you can leave," he sneered at Mr. Sowl. Mr. Sowl was shocked and surprised by Ash's sudden and unprovoked rudeness. Mr. Sowl responded, "You can leave. You are dismissed. I can't leave." He pointed to his wife's car, blocked in by the stretcher and emergency vehicles. Simultaneously, other bystanders on scene also pointed this out to Officer Ash, reiterating, "We can't leave." Indeed, they were plainly all blocked into the one-way lot by the stretcher and 4 emergency vehicles, which now also included his car. Officer Ash decided he would attempt to intimidate and unlawfully order Mr. Sowl into answering questions. "Okay, then come talk to me." He again demanded, "No, I'm not coming to talk to you. I'm not coming to talk to you." Meanwhile, multiple other first responders were accumulating on scene, creating a crowd of spectators. Officer Ash, feeling embarrassed that Mr. Sowl was not cowing to his authority in front of his colleagues, decided that rather than leaving Mr. Sowl alone, he would instead double down on intimidating and harassing him. He pursued Mr. Sowl across the lot. "Did you pull the bike off him? Did you pull the bike off him?" "No, Mr. Sowl, I did not." He continued walking away from Mr. Ash. "Okay, then you are free to leave." Officer Ash again snarled at Mr. Sowl. "You're free to leave," Mr. Sowl retorted. Officer Ash walked a few steps away and began talking to another bystander witness. It was clear that this other witness had seen what happened with the motorcyclist and the bike and was waiting to answer any questions that Ash might have for him about what had occurred. He started to speak, but Officer Ash immediately cut him off. "What's his name?" "Preston is all I know." "Preston what?" Justifiably not understanding why Officer Ash was ignoring him, was again preoccupied with Mr. Sowl. Okay, I will give you guys a secret here. Why was he preoccupied? Because he dared question his authority. He is the leader. He is the boss. You must bow down before them, okay? That is why they are the bosses. You are not. You better not question them. He was arrested simply for contempt of cop. Okay? But no, he's going to ignore the witness that saw things and continue proceeding otherwise. Okay, but let's get back in here. Officer Ash, now indeed fully ignoring the witness with actual information, who was willing to be interviewed and still fixated on Mr. Sowl, who, it should be noted, was a 60-year-old disabled man with a prosthetic eye, wearing just a muscle tank and gym shorts and standing 15 feet away, bothering no one and just looking at his cell phone, yelled across the lot at him, "You got an ID on you?" "Nope, no ID." "I'm going to need your ID now." "Nope." Officer Ash called over his radio that he had an uncooperative witness. Again, we do not have to cooperate to police. If you see a murder happen right in front of you, you do not have to say a word to the cops, ever. You have to talk in court if you are ordered to do so, but you do not have to talk to the cops. They can put a gun to your head. They can do whatever they want, but you are not required to talk to the police. Show me the law that says you have to cooperate with police. There is none. Alright? Mr. Sowl kept backing away from the stupid officer. Officer Ash, again making it very clear he was done with the encounter. "It's my constitutional right. It's my constitutional right." Alright, so we're going to skip this exchange. We watched it. You stand over here. I have a short conversation. "No, I'm going to arrest you for obstruction." "No, you're not. I'm not obstructing." "Ooh, you're obstructing." Just come talk to me." "No." "Okay, so turn around and blah, blah, blah." So now, defendants, looking on, decided they would assist Officer Ash in punishing Mr. Sowl for his refusal to talk. Both charged in. Officer Ash began twisting Mr. Sowl's left wrist and painfully backward behind him. Mr. Sowl, horrified and shocked, yelled, What are you effing with me for?" Before he could finish the question, all three officers grabbed the rest of Mr. Sowl, to include his other arm, which had been at his side and his body, and they all simultaneously tackled Mr. Sowl to the pavement, twisting both of his arms behind him as they went. "Ow! This is effed up! Ow! What are you doing? I had nothing to do with this." Continuing to twist his arms behind him, locking handcuffs onto his wrists, and compounding Mr. Sowl's pain, shock, terror, and horror, causing him more injury. The three then, using Mr. Sowl's handcuffed wrists, pulled him up to his feet without warning. Exasperating the injury and pain to his now dislocated shoulder. As they did it, Mr. Sowl screamed, "Ow, my shoulder is effed up!" Mr. Sowl's shoulder was observably dislocated. It was also fractured. His rotator cuff was torn, and his collarbone also fractured. He was in extraordinary pain. He would eventually be taken to the hospital, where doctors were unable to put his shoulder back into the socket, causing him to continue to endure excruciating, tearing pain. In the months that followed, he would have to have complete shoulder replacement surgery as a result of the officer's assault. As he continued screaming in pain, I told you, I gave you plenty of opportunities. All you had to do was talk to me." "No, he didn't have to talk to you, stupid officer." The officer then walked the handcuffed and bleeding Mr. Sowl over to the back of a police vehicle. "All you had to do was talk to me. I didn't want to talk to you. I don't have to talk to you." "Doesn't matter," Ash replied. "Doesn't matter that he doesn't have to talk to you, because you do have to talk to him, because he's the law, and you do not question the law." Okay, you do not question the law. Bow down to their authority. "We came over, we saw him down, I came to help him." Well, so you inserted yourself, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Criminal offense of obstructing a police officer is defined. Person who commits obstructing a police officer when, by using or threatening to use violence, force, physical interference, or an obstacle, such person unknowingly obstructs, impairs, or hinders the enforcement of the penal law or the preservation of the peace by a peace officer, acting under color of his or her official authority. In 2005, the Colorado Supreme Court made clear that in an obstruction statute, the obstacle or physical interference may not be merely verbal opposition. Mere remonstration does not constitute obstruction. Mere verbal opposition to the police does not suffice. Instead, a combination of statements and acts by the defendant, including threats of physical interference or interposition of an obstacle, is required. In 2012, the case of Kaufman, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals addressed qualified immunity claims made by officers filed against Kaufman after police arrested him for obstruction solely due to his refusal to answer questions regarding an investigation. The 10th Circuit ruled that no reasonable officer could have construed Colorado's obstruction statute as criminalizing the choice to remain silent when faced with questions that answers to which might be incriminating. Okay, kind of on point, but still not. Okay, I can see how, but yeah, okay. The court. I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing with my grunting here. Is this close enough to be relevant? That's important for qualified immunity, right? Because to break qualified immunity, you have to prove that the cops knew or should have known that what they were about to do violates your rights and they were not following the law. So here it talks. He just didn't want to talk to him. There was no incriminating himself. So, okay, I could see the argument going either way. So he's probably not going to get it qualified. Found the right to be free from such wrongful arrest clearly established, and also reiterated that there could not even be arguable probable cause in such a scenario. Okay, so that just broke their qualified immunity in this case as well. Made it clear that the Colorado obstruction statute is not violated by a mere verbal opposition to an officer's. So good job pointing out the obvious that they can't get qualified immunity. Of course, our district courts and the appeals courts are not very good about remaining steady on qualified immunity. They like to make up their own rules as they go. So this was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, depending on which case you're looking at. It could go either way because our stupid courts. Alright, as such, it was abundantly clear to any reasonable officer on scene that Mr. Sowl had not committed the offense of obstruction by refusing to talk to him. Quite to the contrary, it was clearly established and abundantly obvious to any reasonable officer that Mr. Sowl could not be arrested for obstruction for remaining silent. Before walking him to a patrol car, officers DeLima and Ash then, for no good reason, tightened his already tight handcuffs, causing him more pain. They then forced him into a patrol car where he was still injured, bleeding and in handcuffs, complaining of terrible searing pain in his shoulder. Officer Ash then started walking around the parking lot, telling witnesses that all Mr. Sowl needed to do was to have talked to him for 2 seconds. He stated several times to fellow officers and witnesses that he was trying to figure out what happened. So I do need to talk to him, and so at that point in time, he does need to talk to me, okay? Officer Ash loudly made these statements to both bystanders and fellow officers on scene, which included Officer DeLima and his supervisor, Sergeant Bratt. Every Loveland police officer agreed with Officer Ash's plain misstatement of the law. This revealed either an unconstitutional custom policy practice of arresting citizens for not speaking to police or otherwise coercing them to do so, or a failure to properly train and supervise its officers with respect to the law in this regard, causing the civil rights violations to Mr. Sowl, or both. Wow, that is a huge thing, and with that right there, okay, I think the officers are on notice, but is the city? I think with this paragraph right here, especially number 2, the city might also be liable here. I don't often make that assumption, but this time I will. They might. City normally gets dropped out of these. But, yeah, the city might actually be liable here. Officer Ash, still furious with Mr. Sowl for having the audacity to defy his unlawful orders, told Mr. Sowl he was going to jail despite his observable injuries and need for immediate medical care. He was in shock. He could not believe the half dozen officers on scene were condoning and personally assisting officers and beating him up and falsely arresting him. The officers shut Mr. Sowl in the car, still bleeding and with a dislocated shoulder made worse by handcuffed arms, in extreme pain. Then he went over the group of now at least 5 Loveland police officers and began discussing how they would explain their attack on Mr. Sowl. 6 minutes went by. A paramedic, Shane, who had already been there for quite a while and who had already previously noticed Mr. Sowl's contorted shoulder, walked up to the group of officers and proposed that maybe they should at least let the on-scene medical personnel take a look at Mr. Sowl's injuries, and they sighed and said, fine. You know what? If we must, we must. Okay? I guess, okay? Yes, fine. They're already here. Let's let them. So we're already at 30 minutes, and I'm only halfway through the lawsuit, plus a little bit more after. So this is going to be a long video. If you don't like that, well, don't watch it. Officer Ash then walked back to his patrol car, opened the door, and told Mr. Sowl that a paramedic was going to look at his injuries. Mr. Sowl, desperate for medical care and in tremendous pain, eagerly and enthusiastically approved of that plan. He again reiterated that his shoulder was all effed up and there was no reason for the officers to have thrown him to the ground like that. Officer Ash shamelessly insisted to Mr. Sowl that he had given him plenty of chances to talk to him, and because he didn't talk to him, you put yourself under arrest. Mr. Sowl begged for any one of the Loveland police officers on scene to take his hands out of the handcuffs because of how much worse it was making the pain from his dislocated and fractured shoulder. Officer Ash ignored him, walked away, and muted his microphone so that his complaints would not be documented further. Paramedic Shane could instantly tell that Mr. Sowl had a dislocated shoulder and possibly worse. His rotator cuff was torn and the shoulder fractured too. He stated directly to Officer Ash his shoulder might be out, and Officer Ash smirked and agreed, replying, "Oh yeah, there's a decent chance." He stated to officers that needed to go to the ambulance in the hospital in the ambulance. The officers declined the ambulance and told the paramedic that Mr. Sowl would go to the hospital in their custody in handcuffs. Still leaving him suffering, handcuffed in the vehicle, Officer Ash then went up to Mr. Sowl's wife and told her that Mr. Sowl would be transported to the hospital and then the jail, where he would be booked for obstructing and resisting. Mr. Sowl's wife shook her head. Officer Ash, in response, again stated, a few seconds. If you would have talked to me, we would have been done. And continuing to talk with other people and officers on the scene, Officer Ash, referring to Mr. Sowl, stated that what Mr. Sowl had done were both misdemeanors and there were no felony charges or anything like that, and that if he would just talk to me for 2 seconds, it could have been over. Okay. The defendant officers continued to leave Mr. Sowl and his dislocated shoulder painfully handcuffed inside their patrol car and took their time walking around the parking lot. Talking and examining the motorcycle for damage, there was none. Mr. Sowl remained in terrible pain inside the car and continued to bleed. He continued to complain about the pain his own handcuffed arms were in, given the fact that among other injuries his shoulder was quite dislocated. The officers refused to remove his handcuffs. Meanwhile, during this post-arrest 10-minute period, Shane walked around from officer to officer, asking them at least 3 times to remove the handcuff from the injured Mr. Sowl. One officer finally went and asked the on-scene sergeant if they could remove the handcuffs to alleviate his pain and permit the paramedics to begin providing him with actual medical care. The sergeant said no. No! He had the audacity to question our authority. You do not question our authority. He deserves every minute of pain he has. Finally, nearly 20 minutes after the injuries had occurred, a different supervising officer, another sergeant, came and undid Mr. Sowl's handcuffs so that the paramedics and an on-scene firefighter could examine and begin providing medical care to his arm and shoulder. Mr. Sowl begged for things to be sped up so he could get actual medical treatment at the hospital, telling the officers and firefighters that he was in extreme pain, his hand was going numb, and he could no longer bear it. Whichever hospital is closest, he pleaded with them, just take me there. Ignoring him, Officer Ash walked up to Merson, and they smirked at each other, taking observable outward pleasure in the pain Mr. Sowl was in. Officer Merson smiled and said, "Simple question," referencing Ash's and the rest of the officers' belief that Mr. Sowl got what he deserved for refusing to be questioned. How dare you question our authority? Loveland Assistant Police Chief arrived on scene. He walked up to Officer DeLima and prompted him to mute his body camera so they could discuss how to handle the group's attack and false arrest of Mr. Sowl given his unconcealable injuries. Shortly after, and as a group, all of The Loveland police officers on scene unmuted their body cameras and began marching around claiming that Mr. Sowell's statement of "we pulled it off of him" with respect to the bike that had been crushed and the injured motorist meant that they could have also arrested Mr. Sowl for the felony offense of tampering with physical evidence. Okay, the crime of tampering with physical evidence. A person commits tampering with physical evidence if believing that an official proceeding is pending or about to be instituted and acting without legal right or authority. He destroys, mutilates, conceals, removes, or alters physical evidence with intent to impair its verity or availability in the pending or prospective official proceeding. Like obstruction, tampering with physical evidence has absolutely no application to the facts here. A Good Samaritan cannot be charged with felony tampering and for attempting to render aid to an injured motorist. Indeed, a Good Samaritan cannot even be civilly charged in Colorado for attempting to render aid to an injured motorist. There was also naturally not even a remote suggestion of an official proceeding in the case of the motorcyclist at the time the bystanders attempted to render him aid. There was nothing more than a guy in a parking lot being crushed under the weight of his own motorcycle. Mr. Sowl was one member of a group of bystander Good Samaritans who attempted to render aid. This after-the-fact probable cause idea concocted by the Loveland PD that any of the Good Samaritans could have been charged with the felony crime for having done so is and was objectively ludicrous. Other witnesses on scene, it ought to be noted, openly admitted to having picked the bike up off the motorist. One on-scene witness, Tomlin, repeatedly explained to all the officers on scene that after getting the bike off the motorist, he then personally parked the bike next to the building so that it wouldn't be towed. Not shockingly, none of these witnesses were charged with tampering with physical evidence. Beyond the psychological trauma, humiliation, desecration of his rights as a citizen and human, and emotional injury, Mr. Sowl also suffered plenary physical injuries at the hands of the defendants. He had a fractured shoulder, a dislocated shoulder, a torn rotator cuff. Also, he suffered abrasions and contusions to his head. His knee was scraped off in several places and began to swell and bruise. His left arm was scraped, bloodied, and bruised in several locations. At the hospital, defendant Officer Ash waited around while Mr. Sowl received medical care, eager to take him to jail. Medical staff had to inform Ash repeatedly that there was no way he was going to be transported to jail given his injuries. Deflated. Oh, it's so sad I can't arrest him. Oh man, he needs to be in jail. He wrote him a citation charging him with obstruction of a peace officer and resisting arrest and left. The Larimer County District Attorney's Office dismissed both charges that he had wrongly filed against Mr. Sowl. Plaintiff was injured financially in the expenses for his legal defense through medical expenses and lost time and income as a result of his unlawful conduct. He experienced pain, blah, blah, blah. Upon information and belief, Officer Ash has had numerous issues with and citizen complaints of, okay, we're going to talk about some of those, but upon information and belief, Officer DeLima has also had numerous issues with and citizen complaints of excessive force since joining the Loveland Police Department. Like Officer Ash, he has also been involved in a disproportionately high number of incidents involving use of force and shooting at citizens. Officer Ash has actually shot at a couple people, but okay, let's ignore that. Officer DeLima has also been involved in repeating instances of tackling citizens in that same parking lot where he tackled Mr. Sowl. He admitted as much on video when he commented to a supervisor how he hates fighting in this parking lot. Ooh, it's fun everywhere else, but this parking lot is horrible. Detective has had numerous issues with and citizen complaints of excessive force and credibility issues at the CSU Police Department, known to Loveland Police Department prior to Loveland hiring him. They've had a pattern and policy of retaliatory arrest, police brutality, failures to de-escalate, and using excessive force on civilians. They've failed to train and supervise its officers regarding citizens' constitutional rights to refuse to submit to questioning. Nowhere in any of their training materials or official policies and procedures is even a sentence provided that instructs or trains officers regarding their constitutional right to refuse to submit to questioning. To the contrary, Loveland has a formal written policy directing its officers that they may conduct field interviews with a subject's consent or when reasonable suspicion or probable cause exists. This trains its officers to believe that they may force a citizen to submit to questioning so long as they have either consent, reasonable suspicion, or probable cause. This policy is unconstitutional. Every citizen has the right to refuse to be questioned by police officers. Police officers do not have the absolute discretion to decide who they can force to submit to a field interview. All the defendant's actions, as described herein, were taken under the color of state law. He did need surgery. Prior to this incident, Mr. Sowl felt comfortable exercising his rights as a citizen, to include his First Amendment right to decide when and to whom he spoke. Following this incident, Mr. Sowl is afraid of police and afraid to exercise his rights. This change in Mr. Sowl's life experience has been particularly devastating for him because Mr. Sowl's father was a Boulder police officer for 22 years. Mr. Sowl had previously had great respect for law enforcement. I don't, but he did. He felt great pride in being American with constitutional rights in a free society. All that was stripped from him in this incident. He can never get it back. He will never be able to trust police again. You never trust police. They are liars. They are... okay. He will never be able to fully believe that his constitutional rights are guaranteed to him again. Now, still living in Colorado, every time he sees a police officer or a police car, he feels sick. Okay, so what are they asking for? First claim for relief. Anytime there was not probable cause to arrest him. There was some confusion prior to Supreme Court's 2019 Neves versus Bartlett regarding whether retaliatory arrest claims like Mr. Sowl's ought to be brought under the First or Fourth Amendment in the 1983 context. Neves seems to have soundly resolved this inquiry in favor of the claim being brought pursuant to the First Amendment. To any extent that defendant Ash may attempt to claim that it did not, however, Mr. Sowl then brings this claim under the Fourth Amendment. Ooh, nice catch-all. Okay, Officer Ash was objectively unreasonable. Further, to any extent that the defendant officers may argue that there was probable cause of some other offense besides obstruction, like tampering scheme they attempted to proffer later, there is objective evidence that Mr. Sowl was arrested when otherwise similarly situated individuals not engaged in the same sort of protected speech as him were not. Namely, if the offense for which defendants later attempt to justify his arrest is tampering or anything else related to moving the bike off the injured motorist, then the multiple witnesses on scene who openly admitted to personally moving the bike ought to have been arrested. They, of course, were not, because the purpose of his arrest was entirely retaliatory. Officer Ash decided to arrest him for retaliation for his refusing to submit to his questioning, submit to his authority. This is more abundantly apparent by virtue of all the statements Officer Ash made after arresting Mr. Sowl, to include but not limited to, I told you, I gave you plenty of opportunities. All you had to do was talk to me. That's what happens when you don't cooperate. And, well, I gave you plenty of chances. You put yourself under arrest. Officer Ash's arrest of Mr. Sowl is demonstrated by his statements to before and after the arrest arose purely out of Ash's retaliatory animus in response to Mr. Sowl's exercise of his right to not be questioned. No probable cause requirement for retaliatory claims should not apply when a plaintiff presents objective evidence that he was arrested when otherwise so that's word for word. I mean, so there's the clearly established, right? This occurred, when was Neves decided? May 28th, so 6 months before this, was clearly established. Okay. He literally cannot hide behind the defense of probable cause. Okay. Somewhat comically, Defendant Officer Ash also completely foreclosed such a defense to Mr. Sowell's retaliatory arrest claim in his own written report. In his report, he writes, I chose not to charge Preston with tampering with evidence. I felt that if I charged him, I would also have to charge the other people, and that would not be fair to them because they all cooperated with the investigation. Mr. Sowl suffered injuries and damages as already set forth in this complaint. Okay. Second claim, false imprisonment for the fourth arrest without warrant or probable cause. When Defendant Ash suddenly and without warning grabbed Mr. Sowell's arm, twisted it backward using painful rear wrist lock maneuver, he then tackled him to the ground to arrest him. He effected a warrantless seizure and arrest of Mr. Sowl without probable cause or even reasonable suspicion for such a seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment. When Defendant DeLima, observing Ash begin making a false illegal seizure and false arrest, ran up and joined in. He couldn't be left out of the fun. Don't do this without me, man. I'm here for the fun too, dude. He also effected a warrantless seizure and arrest when they also ran up to join in because join the party. Why not? All three defendants knew or had reason to know that he committed no arrestable offense and that he possessed no probable cause for any criminal offense. He was effecting a retaliatory arrest, and yet they all arrested and unlawfully seized him. Defendant's sudden seizure and assault of Mr. Sowl caused blah blah blah. Alright, third claim. Again, if you don't like my blah blah blahs, buy it yourself and read it yourself, alright? Or pause the stupid video. When Defendant Ash suddenly and without warning grabbed Mr. Sowell's body and arms, twisted his arms. Fourth, excessive force, okay? No officer would consider the defendant's sudden and unannounced deployment of painful force upon Mr. Sowl to have been reasonable or justified under the circumstances. Okay, so here, I'm going to argue with this video, but I apologize. The officers were in the wrong. The other two officers only saw a suspect of a crime fighting back against one of their officers. Did they know at that moment what he was being arrested for? I do not know, okay? I don't know that. I haven't read the police reports. I don't know what they knew. I don't know what lies they've told afterwards. But all they saw was somebody, an officer trying to arrest somebody and him resisting. So I think the argument could be made against this one for the other two, for them participating in the excessive force. I think the other two might be safe here against defendants, all four of them, okay? Yeah, they then kept the observer, denied medical care and excruciating pain, okay? So, yes, that was continued excessive force, okay? I could see them falling under that. The stupid Sergeant Bratt, the on-scene supervisor, personally participated in the defendant officer's continued use of excessive force when he refused paramedic Shane's request to remove his handcuffs, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Fourth claim, deliberately indifferent policies, practices, customs, training, supervision, and ratification violation of 14th Amendment against the city of Loveland. Loveland has failed to train and supervise its officers regarding citizens' constitutional First Amendment rights, including but not limited to every citizen's right to refuse to submit to questioning to police. Okay, those are two very important words. Nowhere in any of Loveland's training materials, we just read something about that. So, Loveland also has a formal written policy. Yep, we just read about that. Because of their failure to train and supervise its officers regarding the rights of citizens to be free of forced and coerced questioning by its officers, and because Defendant Loveland has also trained its officers that it could charge citizens with crimes for the exercise of their First Amendment rights, individuals like Mr. Sowl have been repeatedly subjected to violations of their constitutional rights. He acted as he did pursuant to and because of the policies and training of Defendant Loveland. Defendant Loveland also knew to a moral certainty that occasions would arise when Loveland citizens would not want to be subjected to police questioning. Despite this, Loveland failed to train his officers on their limitations on such citizens. Okay. Also who knew he was on video, that Mr. Sowl could either submit to questioning or be arrested for obstruction. Okay, yeah, blah blah blah. Okay, that's kind of getting boring, repeating the same words over and over. The behavior of the half dozen Loveland police officers on scene after Mr. Sowl was illegally arrested and subjected to excessive force confirms the practice and custom within Loveland PD to violently arrest anyone who they don't like, regardless of lacking legal justification for the same. The cover-up effort that followed Mr. Sowl's arrest, involving all the on-scene officers discussing the idea of claiming he had committed tampering with evidence in order to justify their illegal arrest and completely excessive force upon Mr. Sowl, reveals this unconstitutional retaliatory practice is endemic to Loveland as an institution. Loveland is responsible for training its officers to ensure they perform their duties consistent with the law and to discipline their improper conduct so officers can learn from their experiences and be deterred from engaging in future misconduct that violates the constitutional rights of people with whom the police interact. Their failure to do so has communicated to and trained LPD officers, including defendants, against any that excessive force against anyone who is not verbally cooperating is authorized and tactically or explicitly encouraged. Failure to counsel or discipline misconduct constitutes training which causes future similar unconstitutional conduct. Okay. Malicious prosecution against defendant Ash caused Mr. Sowl confinement. In fact, no probable cause supported the original arrest of Mr. Sowl, a fact that was plainly known to defendant Ash. Caused the criminal prosecution by issuing him a unlawful criminal citation, writing an untruthful report, and thereafter providing it to the district attorney. Defendant Ash's unlawful actions and false allegations against Mr. Sowl were the sole moving force behind the criminal prosecution against Mr. Sowl. The DA office prosecuted Mr. Sowl solely because of the, albeit only briefly, solely because of the false and lawless claims made by Defendant Ash in these official documents. Defendant Ash concealed and misrepresented the facts, as well as outright lied in his account of the evening he arrested Mr. Sowl in order to ensure Mr. Sowl's suffering continued beyond his physical injuries and into the courtroom following release from the hospital. His actions were done with malice. No probable cause supported the original arrest, continued confinement, or prosecution of him. The criminal prosecution initiated and continued by the malicious, deliberate actions of Defendant Ash resolved in favor of Mr. Sowl when the DA dismissed all charges. Approximately caused significant injuries, damages, and losses. Okay, prior to relief, a handwritten apology from each of the defendant officers, appropriate declaratory and other injunctive or equitable relief, compensatory and consequential damages, including damages for emotional distress, humiliation, loss of enjoyment of life, and other pain and suffering, all economic losses on all claims allowed by law, punitive damages on all claims allowed by law in an amount determined at trial, attorney fees and the costs associated with this action, pre- and post-judgment interest at the lawful rate, and any further relief that this court deems. A request trial by jury, and there we go. So, I will be following this case. This case is 30 minutes south of me. I'm extremely interested in it, as I am in most cases that happen down in Colorado, because I go down there quite often. And I'm very, very, very much concerned about what can happen to me when I am showing my First Amendment rights, or my rights. So, as of right now, so today is the 15th of July. Summons request complaint by okay, summons request, summons. So, there is a scheduling conference set for June 23rd, for August 19th. On the 23rd of June is when they put in that schedule. So, I will be following this completely as much as I can and bringing that back to you guys. We're going over all of the different court documents. What do you guys think? Were the officers in the right? Should he have just conceded? I mean, Preston was kind of an asshole, right? So he deserves everything that happened to him. What do you guys think? Were the officers wrong? What were they right about? What did they do right? What did they do wrong? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you and have a great night.